What's the real price of absolute power? What happens when you build an empire not on loyalty, not on prosperity, but on pure, calculated terror? Imagine a king so proud of his own cruelty that he carved it into stone for all of history to see. I built a pillar of skulls before the city gate. I flayed the nobles who had rebelled and draped their skins over the pillar. This wasn't a boast from some mythological villain. This was the recorded, historical policy of the Assyrian kings. They didn't just conquer their enemies, they made them a warning. A living, screaming message to anyone who even thought about defying them. Through a mastery of psychological warfare and unmatched military might, they forged the largest, most dominant empire the world had ever seen. Their armies were unstoppable, their punishments were the stuff of nightmares, and their control felt absolute. But here's the paradox. What happens when an empire inspires so much hatred, so much visceral rage, that its enemies unite for the sole purpose of not just defeating it, but wiping it from the very memory of the earth? This is the story of history's most brutal empire, and how the very terror that fueled its rise became the architect of its spectacular, and complete, downfall. Before the reign of terror, there was chaos. Around 1200 BCE, the ancient world was rocked by one of the most mysterious catastrophes in human history, the Late Bronze Age collapse. Great empires that had stood for centuries, like the Hittites and the Mycenaeans, just crumbled into dust. The trade routes that were the lifeblood of civilization dried up, cities burned, and entire societies disintegrated. In the power vacuum that was left, survival belonged to the ruthless. Out of this crucible of collapse, one kingdom in northern Mesopotamia held on, Assyria. Centered around their ancient city of Ashur, the Assyrians had been a regional power for a long time, but the chaos of the wider world gave them a unique opportunity. For centuries, they'd been hemmed in, a secondary player in a world of giants. Well, now the giants were dead. The world was fractured, vulnerable, and ripe for the taking. But Assyria itself was weak, facing invasions and instability. Their first attempts at expansion were shaky and didn't last. It was clear that to dominate this new, brutal world, a new kind of power was needed. A new kind of army. And a new philosophy of rule. That philosophy started to take shape under kings who understood that fear was a far more potent weapon than bronze or iron. One of the first to truly weaponize terror as an official tool of the state was Ashurnasirpal II, who took the throne in 883 BCE. He didn't just win battles, he curated nightmares. His own royal inscriptions aren't dry accounts of conquest, they're chillingly detailed catalogues of brutality. After taking one rebellious city, he boasted, "I felled 3,000 of their fighting men with the sword. I captured many troops alive, I cut off of some their arms and hands, I cut off of others their noses, ears, and extremities. I gouged out the eyes of many troops. I made one pile of the living and one of heads." This wasn't just battlefield rage, this was policy. It was a performance. The survivors, mutilated and blinded, were intentionally left to wander as living proof of the cost of defiance. Ashurnasirpal's favorite methods were flaying and impalement, and he made sure everyone knew it. He recorded how he would skin rebel leaders alive and plaster their skins onto the walls of their own cities, a grotesque wallpaper of warning for all to see. He put up pillars of severed heads and lined hills with impaled captives, whose slow, agonizing deaths were a public spectacle. These horrors were carved in intricate detail onto stone reliefs that decorated his palace at Nimrud. Imagine you're a diplomat visiting the king. You have to walk through hallways where every single wall is a high-definition mural of what happens to Assyria's enemies. You'd see soldiers systematically slitting throats, scribes meticulously counting piles of severed heads, and men being impaled on sharp stakes. The message couldn't be clearer: submit, or this is you. This was psychological warfare on an imperial scale, designed to crush the will to resist before a single arrow was even fired. Ashurnasirpal II laid the foundation. He proved that terror worked. But his empire, as fearsome as it was just the beginning. His successors would take his brutal blueprint, refine it, and build a machine of conquest that would swallow the known world. The weapon had been forged. Now, it was time to perfect it. Ashurnasirpal's brand of terror was brutally effective, but it was also chaotic. To build a true, continent-spanning empire, that cruelty needed to be systematized. It needed infrastructure. It needed a totally new kind of army. That evolution came a century later, with the rise of a king who would fundamentally rewrite the rules of empire, Tiglath-Pileser III. When Tiglath-Pileser III seized the throne in a coup in 745 BCE, Assyria was in a period of weakness. Provincial governors had become way too powerful, treating their territories like personal kingdoms. The army was still mostly made up of conscripts, farmers called to fight only during the summer. Tiglath-Pileser saw that this part-time model just wasn't going to cut it. To build a permanent empire, he needed a permanent army. His solution was revolutionary. He created the world's first professional standing army. No more relying on seasonal farmers. He hired and trained men as full-time soldiers, creating a disciplined, year-round fighting force. He equipped them with iron weapons, which were stronger and easier to mass-produce than bronze. He expanded the use of heavy cavalry and perfected siege warfare, developing a terrifying corps of engineers who built massive battering rams and siege towers, and dug tunnels to undermine enemy walls. The Assyrian army became a sophisticated, integrated war machine, the likes of which the world had never seen. But military reform was only half the equation. Tiglath-Pileser III also revolutionized how the empire was run. He shattered the power of the old noble families by breaking up large provinces into smaller districts. Then he appointed loyal governors, often eunuchs who couldn't have sons to create a rival dynasty, who answered directly to him. He also set up a vast intelligence network, a web of spies and informants that kept him aware of any hint of rebellion. And he perfected one of the most infamous tools of Assyrian control, mass deportation. When a region was conquered, instead of just punishing the leaders, Tiglath-Pileser would uproot entire populations, tens, even hundreds of thousands of people, and resettle them in distant corners of the empire. This policy was diabolically clever. It shattered local identities, broke up resistance networks, and supplied labor for the empire's grand building projects. It was a vast, cruel, and brutally effective method of social engineering, designed to erase conquered cultures and forge a new imperial identity under Assyrian rule. With his new army and policies, Tiglath-Pileser III unleashed a storm of conquest. He campaigned relentlessly, almost every single year of his reign. He subdued Babylonia, marched north to defeat the kingdom of Urartu, and pushed west to the Mediterranean, conquering kingdoms across Syria and the Levant. By the time he died in 727 BCE, he had transformed Assyria from a struggling kingdom into a dominant, centralized empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. He had created the blueprint for imperial domination, a professional army, a centralized bureaucracy, and the strategic use of terror to maintain control. The foundation he laid would be built upon by his successors, the legendary Sargonid dynasty, who would take Assyria to its absolute peak of power and brutality. The war machine was perfected. And for the next century, no one could stand in its way. Section 3, The Empire of Blood and Dust. The stage Tiglath-Pileser III set gave rise to the most powerful and infamous dynasty in Assyrian history, the Sargonids. For a century, these kings, Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal, ruled over the largest empire the world had yet known. Their dominion stretched from the mountains of Iran to the island of Cyprus, and from modern-day Turkey down into the heart of Egypt. They were the undisputed superpowers of their age, and their reigns marked the absolute apex of Assyrian might. Sargon II, who founded the dynasty, continued his predecessor's work with ruthless efficiency. But it was his son, Sennacherib, who became one of antiquity's most notorious rulers. Sennacherib was a master of the siege, and his campaign against the kingdom of Judah in 701 BCE is immortalized not only in his own records but in the Bible. His brutal sack of the city of Lachish was so important to him that he dedicated an entire room in his massive palace at Nineveh to depicting it. These Lachish reliefs are basically a stone documentary of Assyrian warfare. You see siege ramps being built, battering rams pounding the gates, and finally, the gruesome aftermath, soldiers flaying prisoners and impaling them on stakes. It's a chillingly sterile depiction of utter devastation. Sennacherib's greatest and most terrible act, however, was reserved for the ancient city of Babylon. After years of rebellions led by the Babylonians, an enraged Sennacherib marched on the city in 689 BCE and unleashed a fury that shocked the ancient world. He didn't just conquer it, he annihilated it. In his own words, he ordered his soldiers to slaughter its people, demolish its temples, and even divert canals to flood the ruins, trying to wipe the city from existence. His son, Esarhaddon, took a different path. Realizing that his father's extreme brutality in Babylon had only fueled more hatred, he ordered the city to be rebuilt, casting himself as a restorer. But this softer touch didn't mean a lack of ambition. Esarhaddon achieved what no Assyrian king before him ever could, the conquest of Egypt. In 671 BCE, his armies captured the capital of Memphis and made the land of the pharaohs a province of the Assyrian Empire. Assyria was now at its absolute greatest extent, a true world empire. His successor was Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, and a fascinating, deeply contradictory man. On one hand, he was as ruthless as any of his ancestors. His reliefs show him hunting lions and waging brutal campaigns, and his inscriptions boast of horrific punishments, like forcing a defeated king to live in a dog kennel with a chain through his jaw. Yet, on the other hand, Ashurbanipal was a scholar. A man of letters obsessed with preserving knowledge. He sent scribes across the empire to collect and copy every piece of writing they could find, myths, histories, scientific texts, you name it. He gathered all of it in his great library at Nineveh, the first systematically collected and catalogued library in world history, an unparalleled achievement of cultural preservation. This is the great paradox of Assyria. Its kings were destroyers and builders, savage warlords and patrons of culture. Ashurbanipal, the king who slaughtered his enemies and carefully curated a library, embodied this contradiction. His empire stood at the pinnacle of its power, seemingly invincible. But beneath the surface, the foundations were cracking. A century of relentless brutality hadn't cowed the world. It had filled it with a burning, unifying hatred. The conquered peoples were not broken, they were waiting. For over a century, the Assyrian war machine had been invincible. Its name was a synonym for terror. But ruling through fear is a dangerous game. It might get you obedience, but it never inspires loyalty. It breeds a deep, corrosive hatred that just waits for any sign of weakness. And after the death of Ashurbanipal in 631 BCE, the weakness began to show. His sons inherited a vast, overstretched empire, and they just didn't have his skill. A series of bitter civil wars erupted over the succession, draining the strength of the Assyrian army. For the first time in generations, the all-powerful empire looked vulnerable. And its enemies, who had suffered under the Assyrian boot for so long, saw their chance. The rebellion began where Assyrian oppression had been felt the longest, Babylonia. In 626 BCE, a Chaldean leader named Nabopolassar seized the throne of Babylon and declared its independence. The Assyrian king tried to crush the revolt, but his armies, weakened by infighting, couldn't deliver the final blow. This stalemate allowed Nabopolassar to consolidate his power and establish what would become the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But Nabopolassar knew he couldn't destroy Assyria alone. He needed allies. He found them in the Medes, a powerful people from the mountains of modern-day Iran who had also suffered under Assyrian rule. In a historic move, these two rising powers formed a military coalition. It was an alliance built on a single, shared goal, the complete and utter destruction of the Assyrian Empire. They were soon joined by others, like nomadic horsemen who smelled blood in the water. For the first time, Assyria faced a united front, an alliance fueled by generations of rage. The tide of war turned with shocking speed. In 614 BCE, the Medes swept down and sacked the city of Assur, the ancient religious heart of the Assyrian homeland. The destruction of their most sacred city was a devastating psychological blow. 2 years later, in 612 BCE, the combined armies reached their ultimate target, the magnificent capital city of Nineveh. It was one of the greatest cities in the world, protected by massive walls. For 3 months, the coalition laid siege to it. Finally, they broke through. And what followed was not a conquest, but an eradication. The city was plundered and burned. The grand palaces, decorated with reliefs celebrating centuries of victory, were smashed to rubble. The temples were desecrated. The great library of Ashurbanipal, holding the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamia, was buried and lost to the world for over 2,000 years. The vengeful armies showed Nineveh the same mercy Assyria had shown to so many other cities, none. The fall of the capital was the death blow. The last Assyrian remnants made a final stand in the city of Haran, but it was too little, too late. By 609 BCE, the last vestiges of Assyrian resistance were crushed. The empire that had terrorized the world for 3 centuries was gone. Its destruction was so absolute that its great cities were abandoned, their locations eventually forgotten. The annihilation was so complete that for centuries, the once mighty Assyrians were reduced to little more than a fearsome legend. The world they had brutalized had united to repay them in kind. The story of the Assyrian Empire is a stark lesson on the nature of power. They were, without a doubt, masters of warfare and administration. They pioneered innovations that would define empire for millennia: the professional army, advanced siege engineering, a centralized government. In many ways, they wrote the playbook for what it meant to be an empire. But their legacy is forever stained by the ink they themselves used to record their atrocities. They chose to build their empire on a foundation of terror, believing fear was the most effective tool of control. And for a while, they were right. It worked. But here's the fatal flaw in their philosophy. Terror is a double-edged sword. It doesn't pacify people, it makes them hate you. The pain and humiliation the Assyrians inflicted didn't just disappear. It grew into a singular, burning desire for revenge. They became so universally despised that their downfall wasn't just a political collapse, it was a popular crusade for annihilation. The very cruelty that was the instrument of their rise became the seed of their destruction. When we look back at the rubble of Nineveh, we see the ultimate fate of an empire built on fear alone. The Assyrians mastered the art of making their enemies a warning, but in the end, they became the most powerful warning of all, that no empire is so mighty it can withstand a world united in hatred against it. Their story reminds us that while terror can build a throne, it can never make it secure. If you find this journey into the dark heart of history fascinating, and believe there are lessons to be learned from it, then subscribe for more stories like this one. And feel free to share this with a fellow history enthusiast, because understanding the past, in all its brutality and complexity, is one of the best ways to understand our world today.